The dropship descended onto Trial Moon in a plume of golden dust, its repulsors rattling the loose stones across the cracked surface like marbles spilled across a dry riverbed. Inside the humming metal shell, cadets stood shoulder to shoulder, shifting in their exosuits, exchanging confident smirks and predatory grins. All except one. In the far corner of the hold, a human stood silently, arms crossed, observing the others with a calm, unreadable gaze. His name was Liam Harper, and he was the only Terran among the group of 20. The rest of the unit hailed from across the quadrant, hulking Corellans with armor-plated skin and tusked jaws, sleek, four-eyed Zyrathi whose lithe forms shimmered faintly with adaptive camouflage, and the ever-arrogant Torvenians, reptilian and sharp-tongued, who believed strategy was a birthright encoded in their DNA. Most of them didn't acknowledge Liam at all. A few made the effort to chuckle loudly when he pulled out a simple cloth satchel instead of a powered field pack. One Torvenian cadet named Kess leaned close enough to let his scaled shoulder bump Liam's and muttered, "Brought lunch, Terran? Or are you planning to eat rocks?" Liam didn't respond. He just glanced at the cadet's gleaming gauntlets and then returned his gaze to the display above the exit hatch. A digital countdown marked the final seconds before deployment. The mission had been briefed 2 nights prior. Survive and eliminate opposition. No weapons, no external assistance. Each cadet was to rely solely on instinct, intellect, and environmental manipulation. The goal was to evaluate creative combat performance in an unpredictable terrain. The instructors called it Survivor Doctrine. The cadets called it Legalized War Games. When the hatch cracked open, light streamed into the darkened hold, blinding white and harsh. The world outside was desolate. Gray dunes, jagged basalt formations, and the occasional flicker of weak ion storms rippling across the horizon. The air was breathable, barely, and the gravity about 20% below standard. As the cadets leapt from the platform, some shouted war cries. Others sprinted into the hills, eager to carve names into glory before the first lunar night fell. Liam walked out last. He didn't run. He took a slow, deliberate path to the northwest, skirting the edge of a dried-up lake bed that glimmered with mineral veins and fractured ice. No one followed him. Most didn't even notice he was gone. Within the first hour, the tracker drones already captured 3 skirmishes. In a sandstone ravine, 2 Quarlans slammed into a trio of Zyrathi, their brute strength clashing against agile tactics. One drone spiraled to the side to capture a close-up of a Quarlan, shattering the ground with a thunderous fist, sending one of the Zyrathi tumbling backwards in a blur of motion. Blood was spilled, sensors logged damage ratios and projected eliminations. It was all being streamed to a command center orbiting far above the moon, where instructors, generals, and psychologists analyzed every motion. But in the northwest quadrant, no combat registered. Only one drone hovered, trailing Liam at a cautious distance. He had already stopped walking and was crouching near a tall stack of flat, naturally layered stones. He studied the ground, then took a thin piece of transparent cord from his satchel. Standard issue, but rarely used. He tied one end to a loose rock at the base of the stack, coiling the cord over and around until it was taut. Then he shifted the top layer just slightly, so it seemed precariously balanced. He walked back, pulling the cord across the path, and used a piece of bent metal from a dropped pack as a trigger point. Then he left. Further up the trail, he dug his heel into the sand, noting how it held shape. Perfect for impressions. Using a scavenged branch, he brushed over his real footprints and created a decoy trail, leading away from his actual path. He sprinkled fine gravel over one stretch, then used a reflective shard of alloy to create a glint in the distance, a lure for curious eyes. By the second hour, Liam had constructed 4 traps, using only natural materials, a bit of cord, and the occasional fragment of discarded gear. 2 were designed to incapacitate, dropping heavy rocks onto exosuits to disable movement. 1 was meant to startle, a spring-loaded noise trap, using tensioned vines and a vibration trigger. The last was more complex, a tripwire system connected to a downed solar panel that would flash blinding light and emit a high-pitched frequency, disorienting anyone within range. While the others bled and brawled, Liam disappeared into the rock formations like a ghost, never engaging directly, never chasing glory. Meanwhile, in the southern basin, Kes, the Torvenian who had mocked Liam earlier, was in pursuit of a wounded Zyrothi. His claws were slick with dust, and his breath came in rasps, but he grinned through it. He had just cornered his target when a loud crack echoed through the ridge. He turned just in time to see a massive slab of stone crashing down, narrowly missing his head. His companion wasn't so lucky. The trap had been triggered. Confusion swept through the group. Who set that? How? No one had seen anyone nearby. By the 4th hour, 2 teams had been wiped from the game. Not through combat, through traps. Drone footage showed cadets caught in nets, blinded by light bursts or simply vanishing into concealed pits. The instructors watching from orbit began whispering among themselves. One paused the stream and rewound the footage. There, right before the slab fell, a faint glimmer of cord in the light, and a human silhouette in the background, walking away. The name Harper appeared on a tactical screen, highlighted in amber. Back on the surface, Liam took a moment to rest beneath an overhanging rock ledge. He sipped from a handmade filtration pouch filled with collected condensation, eyes scanning the landscape. He wasn't concerned with winning. He was focused on surviving, smartly, methodically, without unnecessary violence. In his mind, this wasn't a battlefield, it was a puzzle, and he was very good at puzzles. As the first lunar night crept across the cratered terrain, casting long shadows and deep cold, most cadets were still fighting or hunting. Liam was already inside a shallow cave, insulated with gathered moss and layered stone, wrapped in thermal cloth pulled from his satchel. A fire, small and controlled, flickered behind a makeshift reflector wall of metal fragments. The heat wouldn't show on most sensors. The smoke dispersed almost instantly in the thin air. He sat with his knees pulled up, staring at the flames. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't smug. He was thinking. Above him, satellites shifted position. The next phase would begin at dawn, but by then half the cadets would already be eliminated and no one would have seen who did it. When the weak light of Trial Moon's sun crept back across the horizon, the temperature shifted abruptly. Cold shadows gave way to a metallic warmth that shimmered across the dust and rocks. The terrain came alive with flickers of movement. Drones resumed their silent hovering, scanning every heat signature, every vibration, every breath taken on the surface. Within moments of sunrise, 3 cadets triggered tracking alerts, but only 2 responded with movement. The third lay motionless, his helmet cracked where a weighted stone had crushed the respirator panel. Liam moved before the light fully reached his shelter. He rolled up the thermal cloth, brushed a thin layer of dust over the remains of his fire, and folded the moss insulation back into the crevice. Every piece of material was tucked away or repurposed, nothing left behind. He emerged from the cave with his satchel slung across his shoulder, already scanning the ridges to the east. He knew others would be on the hunt now. Not all cadets had the patience to lay low. Some, especially those bred for aggression, would interpret the quiet as an insult. Someone had to be blamed for the missing squads. Rumors would have spread during the night. He counted on it. South of the ravine, a small group of Torvenian cadets were moving in formation. Kes led them, teeth bared, claws twitching with anticipation. 2 others flanked him, both heavily built and scanning their surroundings with flickering ocular implants. Kes was furious. He'd lost a teammate during the first day, and what infuriated him more than the loss was the lack of a fight. A trap had taken her, no honor, no warning, just a brutal, sudden elimination that left him staring at an empty ridge, fuming. He didn't care who said it. He wanted retribution. As the group moved through the cracked valley, they spotted a trail. Subtle disturbances in the dust, a pattern only someone trained in terrestrial forensics might notice. Kes saw it and snarled. "Terran," he spat, signaling the others to fan out. The trail wasn't fresh, but it was recent enough to stir the heat rising in his chest. He followed it with a single-minded intensity, ignoring the protests of one of his comrades, who warned the pattern felt too clean, too intentional. That cadet trailed behind as Kes pressed forward, eyes locked on the path like a predator tracking wounded prey. 3 ridges over, Liam was already setting his next stage. He had found a shallow trench between 2 basalt spires. The rock here was looser, easier to dislodge, and there were enough scattered shards to create jagged barriers. He measured distance with careful steps, eyes narrowed, then began embedding sharp fragments into the ground at ankle height. Anyone running without care would tear through their boots. He didn't expect to injure. He expected to delay, to distract, to frustrate. That was all he needed: time and distraction. As he worked, he heard the distant screech of impact, a blast of air followed by a sudden silence. He looked up. Dust plumed in the sky behind the southern ridgeline. That meant another trap had triggered, one he'd set the day before and nearly forgotten about. If his calculations were correct, it had gone off at the exact moment a pursuer would have reached the bait trail. He smiled faintly, crouched lower, and began assembling his next design. While Liam continued his quiet choreography, the alien cadets across the arena descended into uncertainty. Kess had lost another partner to what looked like a magnetic snare hidden beneath the sand. It had pulled his bootplate downward, twisting his ankle and locking him to the terrain like prey caught in a bear trap. He screamed at the others to dig him free, while watching the horizon for the ghost he imagined had done this. He was no longer just angry, he was unraveling. Paranoia crept into his posture. Every rock was a potential trap, every shadow a trick. Elsewhere, Zyrathi cadets moved silently along the outer ridgeline. Their leader, Sylara, had heard whispers during the first phase of the exercise about a human working alone, disabling entire squads without engaging. She didn't believe it at first. But as her group passed the remains of what was clearly an orchestrated trap, twigs shaped to trigger a pulley, dust smeared with oil, a decoy marker designed to distract, she started reconsidering. This wasn't chaos. This was design. She crouched beside the mechanism, brushing aside the sand with elegant precision, analyzing it like a mathematician deciphering a proof. He's planning this, she whispered to herself. And he's still active. Rather than chase shadows, Sylara changed direction. She ordered her team to stop tracking footprints and start mapping the terrain itself. If we move the way he wants, she warned, we'll end up like the others. We're not hunting a warrior, we're hunting an architect. On the central plateau, another trap was sprung. A cadet from the Draxen species, a tall, armored being known for endurance rather than reflexes, had run straight into a corridor of mirrors Liam had erected using broken visors and polished stones. The reflections confused her motion sense, disoriented her orientation, and sent her crashing into a concealed pit. Her distress beacon triggered as she fell, and the surrounding drones moved in to assess. From orbit, instructors watched and recorded. The human had just eliminated his 7th opponent. Back on the ridge, Liam finished his stone barrier and checked the wind direction. He adjusted the placement of a scent marker he'd collected from a Quarland food ration, an oddly pungent chemical known to attract many carnivorous species. It was a gamble, but if one of the larger, more aggressive cadets was downwind, it might draw them in. He wasn't interested in confrontation, just control. As he stood up, he spotted movement to the north, a drone, but not one assigned to his quadrant. It hovered, then dipped behind a boulder. Someone was watching from closer than expected. Liam didn't hesitate. He retreated into a rock fissure, pulled a slab across the opening, and held his breath. Footsteps followed minutes later. A Torvenian cadet, separate from Kess's group, was moving cautiously through the pass. He had no idea he was being funneled. Liam had left fragments on the trail, pieces that looked like accidental drops, inviting curiosity. The cadet followed the trail, ignoring his own instincts, too eager for a clue. When he stepped into the trap circle, a line of small rocks under tension snapped upward, launching a net woven from dried vines and steel wire. It wrapped around his limbs and yanked him into the air, suspending him upside down as he screamed and thrashed. A moment later, the net released, and he fell hard, stunned but conscious. Before he could recover, Liam emerged, placed a bright marker on his chest, and disappeared again into the rocks. That made 8. By midday, word had spread across the survivors. The human was the threat. No one had seen him, no one had fought him, but his presence echoed in every corner of the arena. Cadets started to move more cautiously. Formations broke down. Trust dissolved. The exercise, meant to test teamwork, was unraveling into a paranoid manhunt, led by fractured alliances and fear of the unseen. In the command center above, an instructor finally voiced what others had been avoiding. This isn't a test anymore. It's a lesson. No one disagreed. Liam, crouched in the shade of a boulder, eating a protein bar with calm precision, didn't know how many opponents remained. He didn't care. He had already reshaped the rules. The light began to shift again. Afternoon on Trial Moon was a cruel thing. Shadows grew sharper, temperatures soared without warning, and the brittle terrain radiated heat like coils in an ancient forge. Liam crouched beneath an overhang of scorched rock, the filtered cloth of his hood pulled low over his brow. He hadn't spoken a word aloud since the dropship left. Words weren't necessary in a landscape where noise was a liability. Movement, thought, timing, those were his tools. He had long since memorized the path of the sun here, how the rocks cracked when heated, where the brittle edges of the cliffs could be turned into sound traps if pressure was applied just right. He worked in silence, letting the world give him its signals. And it did. Just faintly, but enough. Upwind, a gust brought the unmistakable smell of Torvanian's skin, an acrid blend of iron and sour oil. That meant Kess was close again. Liam had counted on his persistence. Arrogance and desperation made poor camouflage. The cadence of Kess's movements was distinct. He marched with short, punctuated steps, his claws never dragging, always lifted with precision. But there was another set of movements near him now, lighter, more cautious. Someone else had joined him. Liam listened, heart steady, brain filtering distance and terrain. 2 others, at least. 3 total. He shifted slightly and began removing the components from his satchel. He laid them out. A broken visor lens, a thin wire wrapped in algae insulation, the torn emitter head from a damaged flare stick. His fingers moved with practiced care, combining them into a primitive proximity alert. The lens would catch the sunlight and redirect it onto the emitter's residue, creating a sudden flash when the beam was broken. He wedged it into the rock's crevice, adjusted the angle, then backed away, covering his trail with flat palm strokes and dust. Kess and his companions moved up the slope, eyes sweeping, weapons still forbidden by the rules, but hands twitching with the phantom muscle memory of war. He had discarded patience in favor of escalation. The moment the lens trap went off, Kess lunged forward, thinking he had finally flushed out his ghost, but the flash only blinded him briefly, just long enough for Liam to roll a fist-sized. The sound drew the others, and by the time they regrouped, Liam was already gone. What Kess didn't see was the thin tension line stretched between 2 bone-white spires behind him. The first companion stumbled over it, a cascade of pebbles released from above, stinging his face and hands. Nothing fatal, just confusion. But in that confusion, Liam moved again, circling wide, laying down false tracks as he crept behind the group, close enough to hear their breath. He reached into his satchel and left behind a small piece of mirror, angled just so that the next flash of sunlight would reflect toward the ridge opposite. A bait signal. As the group turned toward the glint, Liam slipped away and disappeared into a vertical shaft, barely wide enough for his shoulders. He descended the natural crevice like a spider, boots finding purchase against rock grooves, hands steady despite the slick dust. The shaft opened into a cavern-like space, half lit by refracted sunlight bouncing off the mineral walls. Here he paused. He unrolled a segment of netting woven earlier from thermal tape and vine fiber and began threading it across the entrance above him. With the net in place, he smeared the cave floor with a slurry made from powdered rock and ration gel. The mixture would solidify quickly in the dry air, hiding any trace of his steps. From above, no one would see anything but a dusty floor. A perfect hide. Above ground, Kess paced in circles, frustration boiling over. The traps were humiliating, not just because they were effective, but because they were so basic. No high-frequency sensors, no plasma triggers, just rope, rocks, and intelligence. He barked orders at his remaining teammate, a quiet Draxan cadet named Joran. The third had gone silent minutes ago, vanished without a trace, his distress beacon still dormant. That silence was worse than death. It meant control had shifted. It meant the human wasn't improvising. He was directing. In a distant quadrant, Silera watched the sun's angle carefully as she placed a reflective disc on a low outcrop. She didn't follow sense or noise like the others. She studied patterns. In her eyes, this wasn't war. It was math. The terrain was a variable. The cadets, parameters. The traps, reactions. She plotted where each known trap had been, then drew a geometric web in her datapad. The center of the pattern didn't lead to chaos. It led to deliberate symmetry. And at the very center, a zone that no one had entered, that's where she would go. She moved alone now, having dismissed her teammates earlier. Not out of distrust, out of necessity. Noise and uncertainty would only disrupt her progress. The silence was easier to work with, more honest. She entered the central zone just as Liam emerged from his crevice behind her. 50 meters away, on a higher ridge, he saw her immediately. She didn't see him. He didn't move to attack. He studied her posture, the way she crouched beside a cluster of stacked stones. Her hands weren't twitching like Kess's, nor did she scan for enemies. She was studying the terrain, not reacting, thinking. That was enough to earn his attention. He watched her trace a line in the dust with one finger, pause, then nod to herself. She was building a model, just as he had been doing since the first hour. Instead of setting a trap, he pulled a strip of thermal cloth from his satchel, tied it around a stone, and tossed it gently to the ground below, letting the wind carry the movement toward her. She spun, alert but not startled. Her eyes met his. No weapons, no threat, just observation. She didn't raise an alarm or call for backup. She simply nodded once, then turned and left the zone. Liam didn't follow. Elsewhere, Kess finally found one of Liam's older traps. Disarmed, clearly deliberate. An invitation. He snarled, tearing it apart, not realizing that Liam had been using the visible traps to hide the more effective ones. As Kess smashed the debris, a thin mist sprayed from a crevice below. It was a harmless compound, just colored vapor, but the sensors in his mask reacted with a warning chirp. False alert, but enough to spike his adrenaline, and enough to confirm one thing. The human was still watching. Back in the command center, instructors leaned over the feed with sharp eyes and tight jaws. One of the officers whispered, "He's not just surviving. He's manipulating behavior." Another tapped a screen. "Cadet Harper has eliminated 9, minimal contact, no violations. All by tactical environmental usage, no casualties." Silence followed. Down on the moon, Liam stood still on the ridge, wind tugging gently at the edges of his hood. His traps were running low. Materials were finite. But he didn't need more. The remaining cadets were doing his work for him, fighting shadows, distrusting each other, exhausting themselves in a game they no longer understood. He watched Kess thrash through another ravine, yelling at phantoms, while Solara mapped coordinates silently, methodically. He had 2 more traps to place. Then he would wait. The sun dipped again, turning gold against the cracked horizon. Another cycle would end soon, and when it did, only a handful would remain. The hunt was no longer about strength or numbers. It was about who understood the rules best, especially when everyone else was still trying to play by them. The golden light of the descending sun sharpened into piercing orange streaks, slicing the shadows into rigid forms that danced over jagged rock and dry ravines. Liam moved like smoke through a dead forest, feet barely making contact with the cracked surface. The air had cooled again, not as harsh as during the night, but enough to make breath visible. He didn't mind. The change in temperature shifted the terrain slightly, made the stones sound different under pressure, changed the smell of exposed minerals. These were advantages if understood, traps if misunderstood. He used every variable. He had spent the last 2 hours laying out the final 2 stages of his plan. The first was already in place, a chain of descending ledges, marked by subtle patterns in the dust, and carefully placed shards of alloy to reflect light down false paths. At the bottom of the ledges, he had installed what looked like a collapsed cave entrance, with a small, glowing beacon half buried in the rubble. The beacon blinked faintly, just enough to draw attention, but not so strong that it looked like bait. Anyone who approached would have to step over a hollow segment of ground crusted with loose stones. Beneath it, a simple drop net would snap up and suspend the cadet, giving Liam time to approach, mark the capture, and leave. The second setup was more psychological. He had constructed a crude figure from scavenged armor plates and an empty helmet, posed against the wind atop a hill. From a distance, it resembled a human cadet standing defiantly alone, watching. It was meant to provoke. He rigged it with a proximity trigger so that when someone came within 15 steps, a recording would play from a repurposed comlink. A single sentence, his voice. Come closer if you want to lose. Not to threaten, to challenge, to anger. Kess found it first. The Torvinian climbed the hill on raw instinct, lungs burning, muscles stiff from rage and exertion. He had stopped coordinating with Joran hours ago. The Drax and Cadet had begun questioning him, asking why the human hadn't been confronted yet, why so many were falling without direct engagement. Kess had hissed something sharp in reply, and Joran had simply walked away, retreating into the dunes. Kess hadn't seen him since, and frankly, he didn't care. He would bring down the Terran himself. He would crush the skull of the one who turned a combat trial into a stage for games and illusions. When Kess saw the silhouette on the hill, he didn't hesitate. He charged, fangs bared, heart hammering in sync with his stomping feet. The recording activated exactly as planned. Liam's voice echoed, measured, cold. Come closer if you want to lose. Kess roared and leapt forward, claws outstretched, only to collide with hollow metal. The dummy crumpled under his weight, and he landed hard against a sharp incline, rolling down the other side into a shallow basin. The fall triggered the final trap. A cloud of chalky powder exploded upward from compressed containers, blinding him instantly, coating his visor, entering the slits of his armor's air intake. He screamed, choking, thrashing, digging into his own mask. When he finally cleared it enough to see, he was surrounded by stone pillars, each one marked with crude paint symbols that resembled eyes. Watching eyes. Human eyes. He was alone in a cage made of perception. He had no idea how to escape. Liam, stationed across a canyon with a direct line of sight through a narrow gap, simply lowered his binocular lens and walked away. Kess wasn't a threat anymore. He was a noise source. Other cadets would hear him, others would come. It was time to disappear again. Further south, Celera stood beneath a spire of volcanic glass, noting the sun's new angle and the convergence of shadows against the eastern cliff wall. She saw the reflection from a helmet fragment, not the beacon's light, but a lower glint, positioned too precisely to be accidental. Her theory solidified. The traps weren't just random. They were layered like equations, one feeding into another. Whoever had set them didn't want elimination. He wanted demonstration, mastery without spectacle, control through silence. He did not pursue the figure she saw standing on the distant ridge. Instead, she moved the opposite way, circled wide and descended through a hidden slope behind the eastern formations. There, she found the remnants of one of the earliest traps, dismantled but not erased. She knelt beside it, fingers brushing over the terrain, and noticed a smooth indentation beneath the dust. A heel print, human. For the first time, she smiled, not with amusement, but with recognition. She rose and began crafting something of her own. A signal, made with layered pieces of metal arranged into a spiral pattern and placed under a thin sheet of fabric held down by rocks. It would reflect light only when the wind moved the cloth. A message to the observer: I see your map. By then, the instructor team orbiting above had all gathered in the main observation room. Commander Vasari stood behind the lead analyst, arms crossed, face unreadable. She had seen hundreds of simulations, thousands of training deployments, and enough real combat to know the difference between flair and effectiveness. What Harper was doing disturbed her, not because it was dangerous, but because it was precise. He wasn't just outmaneuvering opponents. He was studying them, anticipating reactions, learning in real time, and converting every moment into advantage. Most cadets spent their energy to earn kills. He spent energy to conserve them. She leaned forward and said to no one in particular, "When this is over, I want to see his long-form psych eval." On the surface, the final daylight bled into a dull copper hue. Liam sat perched on a thin ridge beneath the natural arch, watching the dust flow like rivers along the basin below. The traps were nearly spent, his materials were low, but now it no longer mattered. The cadets were doing what he had hoped. They were revealing themselves. Those who had resisted each other were now converging on the same paths. Sylara had drawn closer, her movements more deliberate. Joran was pacing a wide circle near the western edge, avoiding all central zones, and Kess had begun screaming again, yelling for the human to come face him directly. Liam ignored the noise. Instead, He opened the last compartment in his satchel and pulled out a piece of folded synth paper. It was a map, not of terrain, but of patterns. He had been sketching positions since the first hour, updating based on cadet behavior. Every reaction was a coordinate, every trap a node. The lines between them formed more than a route. They formed a philosophy. He marked 3 locations, where Kess would most likely stumble again, where Silara might decide to intercept, and where he would wait. He folded the paper and slipped it into the fold of his jacket. A low-pitched hum startled a flock of native rock gliders from the cliffs. It was the signal of night transition, the official checkpoint before the final phase. From orbit, the command declared the field reduced to 5. Liam, Silara, Kess, Joran, and 1 unidentified cadet from the first cohort, whose beacon hadn't activated once. A silent hunter, or a failed transmitter. Either way, Liam adjusted his hood and moved east. He didn't want to win. He wanted to conclude the lesson he had been writing across the stone. Night on Trial Moon was different this time. Not silent, but tense. Not cold, but sharp. The heat of the day still clung to the rocks like an afterthought, but the sky had darkened enough that the terrain blurred into soft gradients. Only the most experienced navigators could use this twilight for movement without betraying sound or silhouette. Liam had no intention of hiding anymore. He walked purposefully, head low, shoulders relaxed, his boots touching the ground like part of the landscape. Every motion was measured. He wasn't hunting. He was finishing. He passed through the channel between 2 broken plateaus, stepping over the remnants of his own discarded decoys. The terrain here had changed from brittle shale to hardened quartz, and every sound echoed twice. Above him, a sliver of the moon's upper ridge came into view. That was the chosen ground. Not because of advantage, not because of terrain, but because it was neutral. No traps, no tricks, just the end. He reached the summit 30 minutes later. The wind howled here, strong and thin. The entire basin stretched out below like a graveyard of mistakes. Scattered gear, broken traps, and isolated shadows from cadets who had tried to shape the moon into something they could dominate. But none of them had shaped it as Liam had. He sat on a flat stone slab and waited. She arrived an hour later. Silara climbed without urgency. She didn't carry anything except her datapad strapped to her arm and a utility knife clipped to her belt. A tool, not a weapon. Her eyes were calm, sharp, and thoughtful. She saw him the moment she reached the top, didn't pause, didn't flinch. She approached until she stood 5 meters from him, then lowered herself to sit on a stone opposite his. She didn't speak. Liam nodded once. That was enough. They sat in silence for a long time, letting the wind carry away the noise of the moon. No drones hovered here. The observers had deliberately pulled them back, watching from orbit but allowing this moment to unfold without interference. Every cadet still alive was accounted for. The unidentified beacon had been confirmed as a malfunction. That cadet had fallen the first night, body obscured by an avalanche triggered by natural erosion. Only 4 remained now, 2 standing in quiet respect atop the ridge, 1 circling in the canyons below, and 1 lost in fury near the northern cliffs. Joran had chosen observation. He had followed the last beacon burst to this ridge but had stopped halfway up. He didn't want to challenge the outcome. He had seen enough. He would remain below, watching. But Kess had no such patience. The Torvenian climbed with brute force, claws scraping into the rock, breath heavy, skin glistening with effort and fury. When he reached the summit, he didn't pause to assess. He stormed forward, fists clenched, teeth bared. "Get up!" he growled, voice hoarse. "Both of you! This ends now." Silara stood, calmly, her hands open. Liam remained seated. Kess didn't care. He paced in a circle, looking from one to the other. "You think this was a test of traps? Of tricks?" "No. This was about strength. It always was. You just hid from it." Liam rose slowly. His face held no fear, no malice. Just clarity. "We weren't hiding. You just didn't know where to look." Kess lunged. Silara moved first, not to fight, but to intercept. She stepped into his path, hands raised. Kess struck blindly, and the impact knocked her back, but she rolled with it, avoiding injury. That hesitation gave Liam time. He stepped forward and dropped a beacon rod at Kess's feet. It activated instantly, pulsing blue. The signal was clear. Contact complete, trial over. Kess froze, confusion twisted across his face. He looked down at the glowing rod, then at the two cadets standing before him. Sylara wiped the dust from her shoulder. "You lost when you believed this was about domination," she said quietly. "He didn't outfight you. He outthought you." Kess turned away, breathing hard. He didn't speak again. Within minutes, the sky above the ridge shimmered as the recovery ship descended. The humming vibration of its repulsors shook the air, scattering loose stones. As it hovered, the side panel opened, releasing a soft blue light over the summit. One by one, the remaining cadets stepped aboard. Joran climbed silently, eyes down. Kess entered last, jaw clenched, pride broken. Sylara paused beside Liam and nodded once. "You rewrote the test," she said. Liam didn't reply. Inside the debriefing chamber, instructors stood in stillness as the final data compiled. Commanders reviewed simulation logs, sensor records, drone footage. No violation had been recorded, no rule broken, but the outcome was unprecedented. Liam Harper had completed the trial without engaging in direct combat once. He had registered the highest elimination count, the lowest energy consumption, and the highest strategic rating ever logged in Trial Moon history. He hadn't played the game. He had redesigned it. Later, in a private evaluation, Commander Vasari stood across from him in a darkened room, her hands behind her back. "Why traps?" she asked. Liam met her gaze evenly. "Because traps are questions," he answered. "If someone walks into one, it means they didn't ask why it was there. That tells you more about a person than a punch ever could." She studied him for a long moment, then gave a single nod. "Your record's been flagged. You're moving to strategic development. You'll never run drills like this again." He didn't smile. "I didn't expect to." As he walked out of the chamber, the screen above the door displayed the official summary of Trial Moon 7X5. Top Cadet, Harper, Liam, Human. Category Strategic Dominance. Eliminations, 11. Confirmed. Combat engagements, 0. Rule violations, 0. Special recommendation, Strategic Command Track initiated. Back aboard the orbital station, Sylara watched the summary from her quarters, arms folded. She wasn't disappointed. She had learned more in the last 24 hours than in a year of simulated warfare. And she had seen something rare. Someone who didn't just survive chaos, but who turned it into order. Somewhere in the lower decks, Kess sat alone, helmet on the floor beside him, claws digging slowly into the steel bench. He said nothing. He understood now, in the hollow silence of his own defeat, that he had walked through a field of lessons and learned none, until it was too late. Trial Moon continued to orbit its dying planet, untouched and ancient, waiting for the next round of cadets who believed